I want to welcome everyone here tonight. My name is Alan Katz. I'm the founder of American Public Square. Tonight's program, Cops and Community Policing and Community Relations, is the fourth in a new series called Conversation at the Square, in conjunction with, in collaboration between American Public Square and KCUR Radio 89.3. I want to thank the Mohart Center and the City of Kansas City, Missouri, for hosting us tonight. Isn't this really, it's a beautiful building. I've never been here before, and people tell me that they remembered many years ago when it was Temple B'nai Yehuda, they used to come here, so it's sort of interesting how nice the building has been preserved. Your playbill that you have, you should all have, contains a schedule of American Public Square for the 2016-17 season. Our next program will be the 19th of April. It's going to be entitled Violence, Community, and Faith, Connecting the Dots, and it's a dinner at the Square examining hate crimes and community violence, and more information is available on our website at americanpublicsquare.org. You can also keep informed if you will text civility to 24587. You will be on our text list, and you will be receiving text to let you know about our new programs. If you're a member of American Public Square, we may have a few members. Would you please raise your hand? Okay. Thank you very much. Those of you who are members are the ones who have, by being members, make it possible for us to have programs like this, so I want to thank you all very much. If you're not a member, look on the back of your playbill, and there's a list of different membership levels. If you'd like to become a member, there's a table in the lobby where at the end of the evening we would encourage you to sign up. KCUR invites you to become a news source. Share what you know with us, your observations, knowledge, interests, and passions acquired through jobs, hobbies, contacts, and life experiences. What you know helps KCUR reporters understand what's really going on and why it matters. And again, you can get more information on that and sign up at the table outside. You received a survey with your playbill. Please take the time to fill it out and give us your feedback on tonight, because that's this, by the way. If we don't get feedback from you, we can't improve our programming. So we really urge you to do it, and it's very, very helpful to us. You also received question and fact sheets, and that's what these little things are. They're in your book. As you can see there, see this? It says question on it. If you've got a question, write it down, hold it up in the air, a volunteer will take it, and the question can be asked. If we can't read it, we can't ask it. So please try to be careful with it. The same thing in terms of, and Stephen Steigman, where's Stephen? In the back there, he's our roving reporter. He will read your questions, he will take your questions from you so that we can get through as many of them as possible tonight. Chris LeBeau is sitting over here. She is a UMKC librarian. She's our fact checker. For those of you that have never been to an American Public Square event before, we have fact checking in real time, which means that if something is said by a panelist that the fact checker wonders about, she will check it out and she will let the moderator know if the fact check requires a clarification. At the same time, if any of you think there's a fact that is not correct, you have in your little group of things here, the back side of the question says fact check. Write it down, hold it up, a volunteer will take it over to Chris, and if we can have an opportunity to make sure that we're dealing in a not alternate fact, but an actual fact environment. Several members of our audience have civility bells. Would you ring them, please? Okay, the civility bell is to be rung if somebody becomes uncivil. Now, we live in a society where there's a little too much of that, so we try to keep it to a minimum. So if you hear the bell, that means that chances are you member of the panelists, you have kind of crossed the line. If you're a questioner, you cross the line as well. We ask you not to clap to show your agreement with our panelists. If you agree very much with what they say, we encourage you to go like this. And if you disagree, just go like this, okay? Because what we find out is that if people are clapping when they hear different lines, it encourages our panelists to say things to get other people to applaud. And really, we don't think that's a terribly productive conversation. And before we move on to tonight's program, and particularly for those of you who don't really know very much about American Public Square, I want to tell you a brief story, and then the story comes from Vice President Biden. When Biden was a young senator, he was trying to get more money for disabled kids into the budget, and Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina kept blocking it. So Biden went to the majority leader, who was then Mike Mansfield, and he says, listen, Mike, he says, what is it that Jesse Helms has against disabled kids? And Mike Mansfield looked at him and said, did you know, Joe, that Jesse Helms and his wife adopted a 9-year-old disabled child? And Biden looked at him and he said, no, I just didn't know. And Mansfield said, it's fair to question someone's judgment, but don't question their motives. And if there's any message that we try to sort of pass on, is that we can disagree with each other very strongly, but let's not ascribe the worst motives for someone with whom we disagree. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Brian Ellison. Brian is the host and contributor at KCUR, hosting the political podcast State House Blend, Missouri, and a regular substitute host of Central Standard and Up to Date. He also contributes to KCUR news coverage, including political reporting and anchoring election night broadcasts. Brian is also a Presbyterian minister and executive director of a nonprofit organization and a graduate of Harvard University and Princeton Theological Seminary. Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's good to have you all here. Pleased always to get to meet folks in the community, including those who listen to the KCUR and those who don't. How many of you are regular KCUR listeners anyway? All right, well, the rest of you, it's 89.3 on the FM dial. Very glad to have you all here. I want to tell you about two events in Kansas City that happened a few miles apart and 2 years apart. We covered both of them on KCUR. The first was in August of 2014. It was a demonstration down by the J.C. Nichols Fountain by the plaza. There were hundreds of people there. They told the story, the speakers did, of Michael Brown, the unarmed African-American 17-year-old who had been shot and killed by police in Ferguson just a few days before that demonstration. And they talked about the protests that followed in Ferguson. Speakers at that rally read the names of people who died. There were rallying cries, there was solidarity, there was a sense of resolve. And one of those speaking that night spoke to one of our reporters and said, "What's going on? Why can't they stand on the street and say, 'Stop the violence'?" Talking about the police cracking down on the protesters in Ferguson. "We need to hear something from the police department. What's going on?" Skip ahead 2 years. The second event was just this past January. Then Governor-elect Eric Greitens was visiting the Kansas City Regional Police Academy in the Northland. It was one stop on his pre-inaugural tour to recognize Missouri heroes. After he worked out with a SWAT team unit and met with a group of recruits, he stepped into an auditorium, and there were hundreds of people there. And he decried the so-called Ferguson effect, he called it, and it's an often disputed idea that increased police scrutiny is now making life more difficult for police to maintain order and to recruit new officers. He told the crowd of officers and trainees gathered that day and their families, "Our state was humiliated around the world, and I'm here to tell you that won't happen on my watch." He was talking about Ferguson. There were rallying cries there that day. Solidarity. A sense of resolve. Sometimes, at least in the public's perception, it seems like there are different worlds, two different histories, two different realities. One where police live, and one that comprises the communities that they're sworn to serve. But inevitably, those two realities meet. And what happens when they do, and why, and how that meeting can or should be different, well, that's our subject tonight. I want to introduce each of my guests and ask them a question. Margaret May has been executive director of the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council since 2001. Ivanhoe is the neighborhood we're in now. If you didn't know that, it goes from Paseo to Prospect, 31st to Cleaver. Margaret, you told me that 2 decades ago, crime and relationships with police were a big part of how the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council came to be formed in the first place. As you look at your work over the last couple decades and this neighborhood's relations with police, how would you assess that relationship today?
I would say that we have a growing, stronger all the time relationship with our community police officers at Central Patrol. And to begin this story, back in 1987, when Alan Young and his wife fought 8 drug houses on their block, and when Alan went to the police, to Central Patrol, to tell them what was happening on the block, and he said, as he related things, the police said, yes, we know that, yes, we know the other. And finally, after several affirmations of what they knew, Alan says, well, if you know it and I know it, why is it still going on? And the police responded, we don't know who our friends are there. Now, Alan didn't necessarily like hearing that, but he listened, and the fact that he was asking for help, a relationship, communication was opened between them. And so over time in Ivanhoe, one of the things that the people in the neighborhood realized is that having the highest crime rate in the whole city, and that's what Ivanhoe had back at the start of this century, we had the highest crime rate in the whole city. And the people in the neighborhood didn't like that. And they realized that in order to bring about the change, they were going to have to do things differently. They're going to have to work with the police. Kansas City Neighborhood Alliance was still in business in 2004, and they wanted to start a team policing initiative in Kansas City. And they approached us and asked if we would be willing to participate. And so about 8 or 10, I don't remember the exact number now, police officers from Central Patrol and the same number of residents from the Ivanhoe neighborhood participated in team policing training. It was a 10-hour session that started on a Friday evening and went through to Sunday. And not to Sunday, to Saturday. And the police officers that were there at the time and the residents that were there at the time, one was on this side, one was on the other. But at the end of that 10-hour period, I'm really pleased to say that a relationship was formed. And I really think that that's at the heart of things, is when people can sit down with differing views of why things are, share how they feel, why they think things are as they are, and take the time to listen to each other and then come up with, okay, what are we going to do to make a difference? And so our team policing in Ivanhoe has been tremendously helpful in helping us to work more effectively together. We've got Sergeant, used to be Sergeant, now he's big time, in charge person, Jim Thomas out there. And Jim is a friend of Ivanhoe, and we started what we called a Council of Elders some years back, where the Central Patrol officers, if some youth in the neighborhood were doing some things that were minor offenses that they could be taken to the family court for, rather than take them to the family court where they'd get a number assigned in the system, they would be referred to our Council of Elders. That was a tremendous effort. We have our police office, and I'm over time, but anyway, just many examples of we have to work together, and we have to get to know each other, and we have to be serious in sharing how we think and feel and not play games.
We'll pick up on that. I don't think that bell was saying you were being uncivil. I think someone accidentally pushed the bell, but I may be mistaken. Robert Kuehl is Deputy Chief of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. He's been with the department for 30 years. Currently, he commands the Professional Development and Research Bureau. Previously, he commanded the Patrol Bureau, which is basically everyone in uniform on the streets. That work included the time when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and during the protests and the conversations that followed nationwide. Which leads me to ask, Bob, how would you assess the relationship between police in the Kansas City metro area and the neighborhoods they serve? The fact that Ferguson hasn't happened here, is there a reason for that, or are we just lucky?
No, I don't believe in luck to begin with. I think luck usually shows up at the front porch with a lot of tools and overalls and hard work, and people just credit what happens to luck sometimes. So a quick ground rule for me, I will talk all day about the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. You'll not find me comparing us to other departments because I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think that I'm embedded enough in another department to compare us to them, and I also think it limits us. I think our responsibility is to compare the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department to its own potential. And if we do that, then we don't limit what we can do. So as far as the relationships go, it's basically kind of two answers to that question. I think they're fantastic, and I think they're strained all at the same time. It just depends on vantage point, like most things. I find in my 30-plus years, gosh, that's crazy to even say that sometimes. I don't know how the fact checker's going to do it. She scares me a little bit. Not her, but her makes me a little nervous, but maybe I'll just stay away from facts. But in my tenure on the department, I have never, ever experienced as many thoughtful outreaches from people who have come, and this is everywhere, because I'm everywhere. I can't stay in my office. Like, they're always calling me back when there's something to sign, because as soon as I'm done with my paperwork, I'm out in the community. I got to put some miles on my car. I got to get out there and talk to people, and no matter where I go, people come up and say, thank you for what you do. Thank you for what your officers do. By the same token, I like to hang out sometimes in places where we get asked the challenging questions about why we do some things, because we can't, not only do we have to get out of the box, we got to get off the bus. We got to get out and have these difficult conversations. So I think the relationships are fine. I think there's a lot of, we're assaulted with input all day, and I don't necessarily think that that's a positive thing. I think that we are sometimes victims of it, and that strains the relationship to a degree. And if it comes up, and I'm happy to expand on that, but I don't want to deviate too far from the question. The other question is, and I get this, I grew up on the East Coast, usual what do you call? I was one of those people. I come from New York City, just outside New York City. A lot of my friends are cops back there, and they call and say, they think we ride horses over to Ferguson. They think they don't understand there's cows in the street. No, there's no cows in the street here. But the difference, I think, is that when you have an event that occurs in your community, for example, Kansas City, that is not the time to invest in relationships. The time to invest in relationships is before something happens. Come on. It's like what I did this morning because my kids take all my money. I went to the ATM so I would have cash for coffee. If I haven't made a deposit in the ATM, when I try to make a withdrawal, it says declined. It's no different with a community. If you haven't made investments in your community and you haven't had difficult conversations, when you come upon a difficult event, and let's face it, that's what we do. We run toward things when people run away from them. Doesn't always have to, it's not always a good outcome. We wish it always was, but it isn't. So we've never wanted to have the decline symbol come up when we had to take some money out of the ATM, and that's what it boils down to, because what you get if you have a relationship with your community, in my humble opinion, you get a benefit of the doubt for a few minutes while they let you come up with a statement, figure things out, and that's only because you've built up some trust over time, and you have to be worthy of trust, hence the word trustworthy. And that doesn't happen because somebody gets up on a podium and says, hey, you need to believe what I say. It happens in another place in the brain where people trust you long before the event happens. So,
thanks. From a fact-checking standpoint, I'm going to say that there were, in fact, cows in the street in Lenexa earlier this week, but that's another story.
True.
Damon Daniel is a Kansas City native. He's been working in social justice advocacy for 20 years, serves as president of the AdHoc group against crime, which works to be a bridge between law enforcement and communities. And my question, Damon, is what does that mean? Which is to say, what is it about relationships between law enforcement and neighborhoods, communities that requires a bridge? And we're hearing that there are a lot of positive relationships. In what ways do you think there maybe is still a bit of a ways to go?
Sure. Well, AdHoc for nearly 40 years now has served as a bridge between the community and the criminal justice system, or the community in law enforcement. And, historically, we got in that position really because there was 9 African American women that were homicide victims. They were considered women of the evening. And those cases had gone unsolved, and there was very little attention to those cases. And so this group of concerned citizens came together to raise awareness around those homicides. And back then in the 70s, there were, on the East Coast, what was considered the Summer of Sam. And so a lot of folks thought that the same thing was happening here in Kansas City, that there was some sort of serial killer on loose, and they were targeting African American women who happened to be prostitutes, for the lack of a better word. But those group of folks stuck together and then formed what's known today as AdHoc Group Against Crime. Just a short little brief history about it. But over time, those same individuals also noticed that there's the influx of drugs and whatnot into the community, and really began to take a community and neighborhood approach to shutting down drug houses. But they didn't do that alone. They also worked hand in hand with law enforcement agencies as well to shut down those drug houses. But what had not been happening is folks were not really communicating to law enforcement. And the attitude of law enforcement back then was, give us the information and we'll take it from there. And a lot of folks still didn't have that sense of trust then, and really today, there's still not that sense of trust. And so having sort of an intermediary organization like AdHoc that folks can come to, that can be anonymous, and still know that the information is going to get into the right place and the right hands, has been an extraordinary relationship that's unique here in Kansas City, and has served our city well in a lot of ways. And so I think as it relates to folks feeling comfortable with being able to share tips and things of that nature as it relates to crime. Also, though, AdHoc has served as a satellite office for community complaints. So whenever someone feels as though their rights have been violated by law enforcement, they can also come and file a complaint here as well. And what I've also been told from the folks that have come into our office who don't really feel comfortable going and talking to a uniformed officer about another uniformed officer is that they just don't feel as though that information is going to be taken care of. So knowing that they can come to a neutral organization and have the information relayed has also been important too. And so that's really been the trust sort of building factor as well that our organization has played in Kansas City. But I will say this though, as it relates to the relationship between the community and law enforcement, this particular police department, what I've witnessed is that they do go above and beyond in a lot of cases as it relates to, especially those neighborhoods that are active and organized. They have a good relationship with law enforcement officers as well. It's those that are not well organized and active that don't benefit from those relationships. And then in that case, that's where AdHoc comes into play as well.
All right, well, we'll talk more about that as well. Let me bring in Dr. John Hamilton. He's Associate Professor and Chair of the Criminal Justice Administration Department at Park University. Before that, though, for 26 years, he was with the Kansas City Police Department as well. At the time of his retirement, he commanded the North Patrol Division. John, you've seen this now from both sides, as someone in the department, but also as someone who studies it from outside the department. And Bob indicated he didn't want to assess or compare Kansas City Police to other places, but I'm going to ask you to do exactly that. How does what is happening here reflect what's happening across the country, and how is it different?
I think there are some similarities. First of all, one of the difficulties when you talk about things like community policing is the fact that it's a very nebulous term. It's very difficult to define. It always has been tough to define. Academics will drive themselves crazy in the criminal justice field trying to define that. And so I've always thought that what what community policing really needs to be is defined by the locale where it's at. So what it means for a department like Chicago, for example, and what it means for Kansas City will depend a lot on the needs of the particular community. What I do think Kansas City has done a pretty good job on is assessing what their needs are and trying to develop or design actions to address those kinds of things. I was born and raised here, so we're always kind of a small town that wants to be a big town, but I like that. I think I think all of the things that you see with things that occur with Kansas City show the kind of people. It shows a little difference than it might in a larger city. So I think Kansas City police have done a good job from that standpoint. I do think some of the difficulties come no matter where you are in a police agency of when you get up toward the top and you become a policymaker, you will communicate exactly what you would like to see done. So think of the Price is Right with the game Plinko. All right? As the thing kind of goes down to the bottom where you want it to get, it takes a variety of ways to get there, and sometimes it gets stuck and it doesn't get there. And I think one of the difficulties that police agencies often have is they really aren't necessarily completely in tune with what happens every day on the street. They do the best they can do, but I would probably say that for all of the successes we would talk about for the Kansas City Police, we could probably find people who would say, but you don't live in my neighborhood. Let me tell you what happens when the police come to my neighborhood. And I think it's important that those kinds of things, those kinds of pieces of information are gathered and collated and put together as well. The other thing that I think Kansas City has probably done a pretty good job at is how they hire and who they bring in. I think as a society we have to realize that policing can no longer be considered just some blue-collar occupation that somebody can do. And I say that because I think 50 years ago, if I was going to hire onto a police department somewhere, as long as I could follow instructions, as long as you could train me to fire a weapon, as long as you could train me how to write the reports, answer the radio, and do those kinds of things, I'll probably be okay. That's not the society we live in now. We need people with interpersonal skills, strong interpersonal skills, and those can be trained. So I think that's one of the things that I see Kansas City, I think, has done a decent job at doing, where I think other agencies in some places around have not quite realized the value of the interpersonal work. So I think that helps. I think it's always been a good starting point.
All right. So as we dig in a little further to the assessing the situation in Kansas City right now, and then we will move on to sort of addressing the underlying causes for why there is sometimes tension and conflict. I want to invite you in the audience to join this conversation by writing out questions or comments. If you are hearing things up here that don't ring true with your observations or opinions or experience, you can write that down too. Roving reporter Stephen Steigman will start gathering some of those, and we'll work you into the conversation here shortly. I do want to ask about one particular shift in the Kansas City Police Department, and I should say we're not just talking about Kansas City Police Department either. Many of you are from other parts of the metro area, but there is one that it's sort of a representative question because it does raise these broader questions about community policing. Last August, the big news was that the Kansas City Police Department was changing how it talked about community interaction officers. And moving away from that model. This was where police assigned to particular neighborhoods, attended a lot of community meetings, set up neighborhood cleanup days, helped connect people to social services. Last August, Chief Daryl Forte did away with that title and that specific assignment and said every officer is and should be a community interaction officer. Deputy Chief Kuehl, can you explain a little why that change was made and how you think it's going now that we're 6 months into it?
Sure. I think it's always an organic growth with any change. Cops are notorious for that. We hate the way things are and we hate change. So, sometimes we get a little stuck. But I think it speaks to the bigger effort to change some mind shift, to change mindset, to shift the paradigm a little bit. Because it's easy sometimes, and I've fallen victim of it, it's easy to say, if there's a particular individual who is assigned, and please let me preface that by saying I think our community interaction officers they were fantastic. They did great things for the community. But it's easy when somebody has a job title to say, oh, well, that's their responsibility. And I understand also sometimes, and this is neither a criticism nor an affirmation, but an observation, that sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease. We talk about neighborhoods. Sometimes you just have a fantastic spokesperson who knows the right numbers to call and who to contact and how to get a hold of people. And I'm not, again, it's not a criticism, but an observation. They're often the ones who get a lot of resources funneled their way, neither by intent nor lack thereof. But what happens is when all of a sudden there's not a silo with a sign on it that says job A, hours here, all of a sudden it becomes everybody's responsibility. And particularly now, in the environment that we live in, it's everybody's job every single day, in every single location, on every single call, every time you stop at a Quick Trip and you want to get a drink and somebody has a question for you, you're the community interaction officer. And because what we all talk about up here is relationships. And I'm a firm believer that it's applicable, it's venue neutral and life neutral. Life is not, I used to think 80-20, but I've changed as I've gotten older. Life is 90% relationships and 10% process. If you get that equation backwards, you're on the front seat of the struggle bus. I watch some people in our own organization run around like chickens with their heads cut off because they haven't established relationships, but they want to focus on a process. So I think this is an effort to have many hands make light work. And everybody needs to think about themselves as a community interaction officer, and everyone has access to the resources. We need to take a few extra minutes when we can and delve a little deeper into the problem when we're right there on scene. How about we have 1,300 plus community interaction officers instead of 6 or 8?
Margaret, Damon, what do you share that assessment that that's a positive development, or do you wish that title and that position still existed that way?
Well, while we loved having our community officers, I think that what was just stated was very well stated. And I really think that culture of all of the officers being in communication with, and the people in the neighborhoods feeling like they can communicate with them, is something that should be expected of all the officers. And we have a lot of the officers that drop by, have through the years, that weren't necessarily the community police officers. And let me just share one thing that I think kind of sets the stage for some of the things that are important to happen. We started a lawn maintenance program back in 2003. And one of the days when I went out to the site where our workers were, they were young men, African-American men here in the community, ages 14 to 17. And I was just standing there talking with them, and our community police officers rode by, saw me there, so they stopped. And all of a sudden, our guys just became very rigid. And after the police officers left, they said to me, we didn't know if we should run or what. Now, I think that's telling, if that's how our young people in the community feel about our officers. But when the officers came over to talk with me, I made a point of introducing them to the young men. And what started out as our workers sitting back like this, literally, back like that. And by the time the discussion ended, by the time they got ready to get back in their car, they were leaning forward, and there was actually communication going on. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of. And again, it's exactly what you said, is the need for people to feel that this is an exchange that we need to have.
The only thing I would add to that, I like the way the Deputy Chief Kuehl explained that the ideal behind the fact that everyone should be a community officer. I really liked being able to identify specific folks, though, that were assigned to an area that I could call about a specific thing or area or an individual or house because they were more familiar with it. And so that being able to sort of navigate through the current way of identifying that is a little difficult, but I really enjoy being able to pick up the phone and say, hey, I know that Officer Cooley's in here. He was a community officer back then, but I love being able to pick up the phone and say, hey, this is Damon, there's this house or there's this incident in this specific area. I know you cover that. Can we work together to target that specific situation? So being able to call someone and know exactly who to call is important.
Right. I mean, without any actual experience of it personally, it seems like the tragedy of the commons might take effect. If something is everybody's job, then it becomes nobody's job, and it doesn't get done. I don't know, John. Is this true in other departments? They wrestle with the same question.
Well, I think, of course, academics like to be contrary to everything, so I'll be contrary. While I understand the reason behind, and I understand the theory, I guess my concern is the assumption there is every one of those 1,300 community policing officers know how to be a community policing officer. So I guess my concern with this is, theoretically, I like the idea. However, in practicality, I believe that there's as many different police officers, personality-wise, as there are people that sit in this room. I would personally see better that we would have a centralized person who, as they became that conduit to bring things in, then introduces in the officers into these situations. And then, in essence, I guess what I'd say is works themselves out of a job. And after the connections have all been made, then they can slowly back out. I do believe that it's helpful to have a one place where you are gathering information instead of a multiple set of places. But so that would be my response.
Bob, you want to say one more thing before we take questions?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you. Actually, I worked for him for a lot of years, so it's uncomfortable for me to disagree with him because he told me where I needed to be in a very nice, kind way. A lot of times, he's a great boss, great boss. So here's, I think, while I don't mean to get inside the chief's head, and I'll be the first to say he's one of my best friends, and it's a scary place to be every once in a while, but the man is on a mission. And so here's what I would say. The first thing, I define managing a police organization as an interesting trip down risk management row. And so I have to define, I love Dr. Seuss. I have all the leadership books, everybody else. I also have every Dr. Seuss book ever written. There's great wisdom in those. So if you define risk management, this is how I define it, it's awareness plus action. And so what happens is, I think what we have not required of our supervisors and our command staff what we should and could have required of them in the past. So Dr. Hamilton is exactly right when he says that different officers have different strengths and weaknesses. I will say that the most powerful rank on this department is sergeant. It is where we either mitigate or incur 90% of our liability, which is where good things and bad things happen. They are the linchpins of our organization. And I guarantee you that if I go to any sergeant and I say, we have a community project that needs, say I'm a captain of a watch, and I go to a sergeant and say, I need to get this project done. He's going to look around the table of 8 people and go, yep, maybe, nope, for sure no. And he's going to, because they intuitively know the strengths and weaknesses of every single officer at that table. So what I see happening, and 6 months is maybe quick, is that we start to hold accountable our command staff to identify the groups of people and the individuals who are strong in that area and plug them in where they need to be, and take the ones who are weak and set up a path for things to go right for them, some additional training, some mentoring, or things like that. So I agree, it is great to have a single point of contact. We just need to work at having more of them.
And if I could add something, I retired from the Social Security Administration after 30 years. And my last 8 or 9 years, we decided that we were going to make customer service be something that was the prime thing that we were going to have at Social Security. And leadership, that top person can start to permeate the entire organization. Jim Thomas, I keep referring to him, but that guy's a leader. He understands communicating with people, and the people he will report to him, they begin to act the way he does. And I think that's what we've got to see happen. And if that expectation is not up here, it's not going to ever happen down here. And so the community policing concept needs to be with all 1,300 guys. That's got to be the expectation.
All right. You all have been busy writing out questions and comments, and roving reporter Steven Steigman is ready to bring us some of those.
This is only about half of them, so you guys have some really good questions. I'd like to talk a little bit about this is a great opening question here. Please tell us some of the positive youth outreach efforts involving law enforcement. More specifically, does the Kansas City Police Department have a Citizens Academy, and how do you promote it? And does the Kansas City Police Department have any plans to expand the OK program? I think I have that right, in the city. And for those who don't know about that, I'm told it's a mentoring program for black males age 12 through 18 that puts OK officers, not OK as in all right, OK officers in middle schools and high schools.
Well,
It's on
you might be the person to
I
talk
figured.
about that.
I don't want to.
Don't
feel like
like
The
I'm
guy in the
answer the
uniform
question.
should probably talk
you.
about
my
that.
family would warn me, please don't overwhelm the audience and don't always be the one talking. So I'm just trying to vet
Appreciate
that
that.
every time. So
Question.
you know.
This one seems it's in your
Yeah,
court.
I figured it was. Yeah, we absolutely have a Citizens Police Academy, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. One of the things, and we fill them up. And we fill them up because people leave and they tell their friends and they tell two friends and people line up for them. If we had the money, manpower, and materials, we would run 2 of them simultaneously at all times. I think it bridges the gap and it helps people understand. And right, isn't that what it's all about? Trying to understand each other a little bit more, understanding why we do what we do, and sometimes we don't have the chance to say it. So it's a fantastic opportunity. If you haven't done it, I would strongly recommend it. I'm actually not sure how we market it. You know, I would personally like to hire a PR firm to market the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. Sometimes I don't think that's our strength zone, but I think word of mouth spreads very quickly. The OK program, I know about it. I can tell you that the philosophy is solid. What the intentions are moving forward, I don't know. I'm not directly involved into it, but I hear about it a lot. I know it's a priority. It's not the only thing we do, though. There's a lot of things we do. You know, I'll tell you what. I want to boost this to 100, but we have 80 officers who go once a week for a half hour on duty and read to first graders and third graders and fourth graders. And I'll tell you, it's the Lead to Read program. And I'll tell you, for me, I do it. For me personally, it's a sacred half hour for me. Like, I need that. I need to sit with Ingrid in it's a tiny little chair too, much unlike this. It's a little chair. But I love that little chair. And I love her. And I love spending a half hour with her because I am nowhere but right there for a little while. And we don't talk about other things, we just read. But it's a special half hour for both of us, I think. So we do a lot of other things. I see officers every day stopping it out of their cars and help somebody carry groceries in or do things like that. They don't want a pat on the back. So I think there's a lot of programs, formal and informal, that are going on. But get to the police academy, the Citizens Police Academy, if you can.
Another question or comment, Stephen?
Yeah, here's one. How does the Kansas City Police Department train officers to recognize their own biases, especially along racial lines? And how does the department work to identify and then stop racial profiling among its officers?
I'll start by saying that for a Class A license in Missouri, you have to have 600 hours. To graduate from the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department Regional Academy, it's 1,200 hours. And we feel that we are barely getting, and I'm over the academy right now. Director Wayne Stewart, who's an awesome director, I learn more from him every day than he'll ever learn from me, but he's in my bureau. We feel that we barely get them ready at 1,200 hours to hand off to a field training officer. I can't quote the classes, but we have a number of classes that talk about bias, that talk about diversity, but it's more than that. What we've done for a long time and what we've emphasized even more is the mindset right from the beginning that we do have biases and we need to recognize those biases and we need to be objective in how we deliver our services. So from the day they show up at the academy, it's drilled into their heads. Yes, they have classes. We actually just got a grant put together to bring something called Blue Courage into the academy, but we have a lot of bias training as far as trying to protect it, and watch over it. We obviously look at the number and look at the number of the stops. And, we could have a whole session about biased policing. We could have a whole session about what the stop reports really show. It's interesting because we're policing a society that's very fluid in nature, that's coming and going, and we have officers that are assigned to neighborhoods that have certain demographics. So they're naturally and inherently going to stop certain demographics of individuals. But I'll tell you, it gets back to this. It gets back to this every time. And I'll hold them accountable all day, every day. The supervisors, the first-line sergeants, can also look around that table and know exactly who is doing the right thing, who's on the edge, and who's doing the wrong thing. Now, I am blessed to work for a department. I got hired by NYPD the same week that I got hired here. I packed up and moved out here, just a little bigger than I wanted out there. And I will never look back. But I can tell you that what we also have to do is we have to push accountability down to that level, because that is where the true knowledge about how policing is occurring on a daily basis and how our citizens are interacting with everyone is happening.
I want to press, though, for some of this true knowledge from perspective of folks who are getting the calls like you talked about getting, Damon, the anonymous calls wanting to make reports. How much work do we have to do here? Are things going as smoothly? Are the stop reports showing the full story as you see it, Damon?
I don't get a lot of the copies of the stop reports. That's something I'm gonna make a middle note for. But I think to answer your question, I think that we definitely have a long way to go. And I can only really speak even from my own personal experience, but also from those who come into my office from time to time and file complaints on the police department regarding their personal experience as well. But let me just sort of gauge this with a personal story, if I can. So, when I was 15 years old, it was one of the most momentous sort of times of my life, besides being married, of course. But I remember studying to get my driver's license, and every evening I would come home, my sister would test me, my mom would test me, my aunts, everyone would test me. So when I got my first car, it was a 1979 Chevy Caprice Classic, and I loved that car as well. But as I drove through my neighborhood, I fixed up my Caprice. It was a nice Caprice, and my first encounter with the police department, I got pulled over, and a police officer came to my door. He said, "Get out," and I said, "Okay." I said, "Can you tell me why you put me over?" He said, "Get out and go to the back of the car. Put your hands on the hood." So I said, "Okay." So I got out, put my hands on the hood, and he searched me. Went through my pockets, took out my wallet and said, "Keep your hands on the hood and do not move." Went to his car, ran my license, came back and said, "You're free to go." And I said, "Well, can you tell me why you pulled me over?" He said, "Oh, a car that fit your description was stolen, and then you're on your way." That happened to me several times. And it wasn't until I got to about 21 where I was a little fed up with that. I was in college, and I figured I knew a little something and I could talk back. That didn't go so well. That was the first time I was arrested, and the last time I was arrested as well. But one of the things that whole experience from a 16-year-old even to now, as much of a good relationship that I have as the president of AdHoc with law enforcement officers, whenever I see a police car pull up behind me, I sort of have this anxiety. And it's from that lived experience. And so many of my friends and relatives who look like me share those same anxieties. So I can only speak from that perspective when I say we have a long way to go, when so many folks who I know on a personal level or even professional level, or the folks that come into my office, still have those same experiences and anxieties as well.
If I could add, we had 4 sons, and I have 7 great-grandchildren. And it's just a part of the rule with the males in our family and any young males we encounter to teach them the discipline they need to demonstrate when they're stopped, because it's a given they're going to be stopped. And that's too bad. And that's something, those kinds of things that we really need to be working on today. I hope it doesn't happen with the same frequency that it has through the years, but I'd really like to see some positive action in that regard. I serve on the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. I go over to the family court to those meetings, and the families that I see in the waiting room, in the lobby there getting ready to go into court, it's not predominantly African American that you see there in the waiting room to go into the court. But at the detention facility, when we started this initiative back in 2004, there were around 100 young people being detained, most of them males, and at a minimum 75% African American. Today, we've worked very hard. We get the numbers down. It's about 25 to 30 that's detained now on a daily basis, but that number is still 75% African American. There's something wrong with that. We have data that shows in the suburban areas, the white youth are not arrested for minor offenses and taken over to that family court. Here in our area, or wherever their family court is, in this area, that just happens all the time and again. So, it's those kinds of things that if we really want to bring about change, that we've got to admit it happens, and let's sit down and talk about the things that we need to do to bring about the change that's needed.
But it absolutely happens. I don't want anybody here to think that I don't agree 100% that we have miles to go before we sleep. And we will never sleep because, let's face it, it's a journey, not a destination, and we're on 24/7, 365, so there's no sleeping. But, to piggyback on what he said, those things always make my skin crawl a little bit, because the damaged relationships that happen with an interaction like that are horrible. And, one of the things that we have to do as an agency, is we have to say, what do we own and what can we control? And a lot of it has to do with having a courageous conversation internally, and to not stand by. I'm very proud of the thin blue line that I'm a part of, but I have no issue holding them accountable. Now, I understand that's easy. Say, well, you're deputy chief, that's an easy thing to do. Yeah, well, positional authority has nothing to do with leadership. Leadership comes from the individual. And I see peers more than I ever have before. And yes, it's a big, giant shift that we have to make, but we have to pull people aside and say, hey, we don't talk to people like that. We don't treat people like that. I can give unconditional respect to an individual and stay completely safe in what I do. So it's not an officer safety thing. It's an excuse. I can stay perfectly safe and treat people the right way. I'll use an example. The other day, we drive too fast. Almost all of us drive too fast. There's an officer going down the street. He'd been driving too fast. He pulled into a quick trip, and when I said, hey, we don't drive like that. We can't drive like that. We're going to get yourself hurt. You're going to get somebody else hurt. It's no different with anything else. And when we step up as an organization and we start to curtail, and I think that's one thing Kansas City does better than some. I said I wouldn't compare, so I won't, but I did grow up in a place. So I have some vantage point from that. I think that we have a lot of courageous communication internally, but think of it this way too. The old proverbial saying that a few bad apples spoil the whole bucket. You think how much damage just a few, and I'm not saying we have just a few. You think of the damage that can be done that overrides all of the good officers that are out there trying to do the right thing all the time. So sometimes the negative contacts are the ones that stick in everyone's mind, and we have an absolute responsibility to that. But neither should we forget the vast majority that do a good job out there and try to do the right thing.
Stephen?
First, a little bit of housekeeping. I have one question here from a Jesse Johnson. who said Jesse wanted to ask a question. There we go. I'm going to give this question to you, Jesse. I'm going to come to you next.
I live in the Pendleton Heights neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri, and we have a pretty good relationship with the police. But for a neighborhood that already has a good relationship with the police, with an already short-staffed police department, what's the most effective way for us, or for any community that has a good relationship with the PD, to help you guys do your job? What's the most effective way for us to help you? And also, one thing that kind of ties into this as well is that in the past, we've had officers tell us that, straight up, that maybe if we wanted to let's put it this way, they've made us feel like our concerns are not valid. And so how can you make us feel like our concerns are valid and help us help you?
And I think that could be Bob Kuehl, but it could be any of you, actually. How can individuals in the community better improve their interactions with officers, too?
Well, I will say in a general term, I'm always for building the capacity, the informal control, the informal capacity of a neighborhood. I want to get them to where they're more self-governing, where they can do more on their own. So in other words, they know the contacts to make with City Hall. They know the contacts to make with social service agencies and those kinds of things. And I think sometimes the police can help with the introduction of some of those, but I like the idea of trying to develop a neighborhood to where they can do some of those things on their own. For those of you who did management courses years ago, you might remember situational leadership. That was a popular thing, and it had 4 boxes of how you would manage somebody. But the point of it, the bottom line, was you were always moving up the readiness level of your subordinate. In other words, the point was you were always trying to develop and increase their skill level and their abilities. And I think Ivanhoe is an absolutely wonderful example of how this works, from a very, very small, struggling neighborhood association to one that's very much self-governing now. And I think that's one way, from an overall, academic perspective, of how you can assist the police, is the more things that you are able to do with those connections, then the police become a spoke on the wheel and not just the whole hub. And I believe that in essence is a major assistance.
Let me take a shot at this real quick too. So I think, one, I'm a big supporter of the neighborhood watch programs and wish that we could invest as a city to do more of those and to help neighborhoods who are really interested in doing that, invest in sort of the neighborhood watch signs and those sorts of things. But I think, if you think about here we are in the 21st century with technology as well, there are online tools for neighborhoods like Nextdoor, for example, which is a good online social network for neighborhoods to utilize, and they can also plug right into the police department and provide tips and things like that as well. It's sort of like a neighborhood's Facebook in some ways. Another thing to do, and I always share this with folks as well, there are some concrete things that neighborhoods really can do to stabilize, or at least reduce crime in some ways. So one is, and I always see this when we go out and canvass neighborhoods, especially after a shooting or a homicide, there is a fracture as it relates to the relationship that people have with their neighbors. Very few neighborhoods really have folks that really know each other or spend time with each other. So getting to know your neighbor, regardless if it's that rowdy house down the street or around the corner or what have you, taking time to go door to door and introduce yourself and learn about who your neighbors are is extremely important. Secondly, with that though, you can, as a neighborhood, even on your own block, if you have, for example, overgrown grass or broken windows in a vacant house or something like that, one of the things you can do is invite your local city council person out, or your local PIAC rep. PIAC stands for Public Improvement Advisory Committee funds. There are dollars that can help be leveraged to your neighborhood to address those sorts of infrastructure improvement needs. But invite those city officials, invite some of those city employees out that are from neighborhood preservation or in departments like that. Invite them out and do a tour. Show them what you see and what you live with every day. That is one of the best ways to even point out. I think oftentimes we think about preventing crime and we want to invite the police department to do that when they're not really set up to do a lot of that. We put too much on the police department when we as citizens and residents can be doing so many more of these things. And so I think, one, let me just reiterate, so going back to the neighborhood watches, doing those phone trees, getting to know your neighbors, and so when something goes down, if you see some suspicious activity down the street, you can call your neighbor at work or at home and say, hey, I see somebody creeping around your front door in the backyard or something like that. Are you expecting a delivery? I mean, those sorts of things help reduce crime, right? So those are some of the small but very, very simple things the neighborhoods can do.
One of the suggestions I have is that the police take every opportunity that they can to visit the schools so that the children in our schools can get to know the police officers and see them in a setting other than one where they're being stopped. The more our children can begin to think that the police officers are someone that they know, can be their friend, I think is how we get to the long-term solution. And when our police officers attend our events, they always make the time to be interacting with the people, but in particular with our children. So as our children can start viewing the police as friends, it makes a tremendous difference.
Where's the lady that asked the question? I want to thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I'm going to give you a couple, I'm going to seuss it down a little bit because I love the doctor and I want to keep, one thing is if you feel like somebody didn't hear you, we all have bosses and we want to know. We can't fix what we don't know about. Maybe the person needs some more training. Maybe they need we need to help them get their curves back because they have too many edges. So I tell you what, I'll share a quick story with you and then I have an answer to your second question. I swore a group, it's one of my bucket list things. Before they put me out, turned me out to pasture, put me in a home somewhere, which is, arguably what they might do. I always wanted to swear one of our academy classes in as one of my bucket list issues. And the chief was out of town, so I got to swear him in, and I got to, from up on the podium where you get to have them raise that right hand and repeat after me. When you look into their eyes, they are going to change the world. They are going to save the world and everyone in it. Somehow, sometimes, they lose their way. So if you let us know that they've lost their way, we can help them back, but if you don't, it's hard to do. So please, everyone has a boss, so make a call to the station, say, hey, I just want to let you know I had a kind of an experience that didn't feel right or sit right with me, and trust me, we have fantastic supervisors and commanders that look into it. Second question, the other thing is what you can do to help us. We'd love to say hop in the car, let's go run some calls together, but we're not going to, we're not going to do that. 1,200 hours later, you can do that with us. But here's what I would charge you to do, because this is one of the biggest things that we fight every single day. I would ask that you charge people to have diligent intellect. And I need to explain what that is because I'm going to tell you what the opposite of it is and how dangerous it is to us. When people have and it has nothing to do with intelligence. Unless you're an emotionally disturbed person or unless you're on drugs or too drunk, this is an incredibly intelligent community, incredibly intelligent species. Diligent intellect is when you question things, when you ask, well, how did you know that, or what are the facts behind that? Maybe an easier example is the opposite, lazy intellect. Lazy intellect is dangerous. Lazy intellect, this is how this rolls out. The cops beat somebody down last night and he's about to die. Well, what in the world? Well, instead of, now lazy intellect goes, hey, the cops beat somebody down and he's going to die? The diligent intellect goes, well, where'd you hear that? Or tell me more about that. Well, I was standing in the express lane at Aldi's and some guy down at the register said that. So now all of a sudden this has become fact. And I will say that this is industry neutral. I don't care if you're the media. I don't care if you're law enforcement. I don't care if you're Joe on the street. We are assaulted by partial and misinformation all the time. And if we're not careful, every one of us can become a victim of lazy intellect. And that is dangerous because then the rumors start. I don't hang out at water coolers for a reason. Water cooler talk is generally lazy intellect. And you have to be careful the people you hang out with. We're about the average, if you want to help and you got a group of kids, I think we're all about the average of about the 5 people we hang out with the most. So choose wisely who you spend your time with. But if you can have people stop and question, and I don't care who made the statement, we should all be able to uphold the scrutiny of questions. And I know that we talk a lot about transparency and things like that, but there is a lot of lazy intellect out there, and that spawns a lot of rumors, and once that snowball goes down the hill, it's hard. So that's my charge to you.
I feel like there's a piece of the conversation that we're not having, and maybe we're not able to have because of who's in the conversation. It feels to me like this conversation, and it's American Public Square, it's all about civility, so maybe we wouldn't have that conversation here, but this is a conversation that's happening all over the country, including in Kansas City, often without a lot of civility, often with a lot of anger. There are people who maybe wouldn't be part of a conversation like this because to sit on a panel with police officers, with activists who've been doing this for 20 years, takes a level of trust, a level of belief in the system, a low grade of anger that isn't present for everybody. There are significant, I would argue, segments of the community who wouldn't engage the way this conversation is happening, and who might even engage in conversations that sound like lazy intellect, to use your term, Bob, but are coming from a place of deep anger and deep distrust. Maybe not laziness, but maybe even born of experience. So I guess my question is, we can talk about communication and how to improve that. We can talk about leadership skills and how to improve that. But what do you do about anger and distrust that is already now present? The cat's out of the bag. What do you do to address that in a way that's meaningful, in a way that brings about transformation?
Well, I would say anger is a result of unmet needs. So I think it is one of those things that happens when my needs aren't met. Anger is usually one of the responses. Anger can be a positive thing. It can be very negative. It can be destructive. It can be constructive. It's however you make that. I think that what goes along an awful lot with that, though, is kind of another one of these maybe touchy-feely terms of dignity. And it's the idea of everybody has a sense of dignity. And I think that's what often gets lost in this is we as a society, but I know it's easy sometimes as police, to see people with maybe not having as much dignity. So if I'm on the streets, I'm not necessarily, I may see you in a way where you don't seem like you have much value to me, but you have dignity. And so if I have an interaction with you that doesn't respect your dignity, then that's what's going to devolve into these kinds of problems. And I think then once that is divided, then the question is, how do you build a bridge? Well, it's much easier than to keep the divide from happening than it is to try to build a bridge back. So I think the main lesson for us is any of these conversations is the importance of active listening. And it's not what we all do well. It's not what we're trained to do. We're trained to argue our points. And so to learn how to listen and to actively listen is to give somebody the dignity to let them know, okay, we may disagree, but I value what you have to say, and then we work from there. I mean, that's just kind of a general way I would see the whole thing.
Anyone else?
I'll share a little story with you that exemplifies that very thing, and I think sometimes we're also victimized by history of this industry. I think that we're having to make up for a lot of lost time, and I guess, analogies or examples are always the best way for me to share something. My son's a new officer, and he came home very troubled with an incident and we talk about it. I try to stay out of his way, let him find his own way. It's what we all have to do. He came home and he was on a car check with his partner, and an elderly gentleman, probably 70, was taking his grandkids, who were about 5, to the store. And my son and his partner were just waiting for the dispatcher to get back. And they said, "Hi kids, how are you?" And he yanked his kids. He says, "Don't talk to them, they shoot us. Don't talk to them, they shoot us." So that was very real that's what he believed. That's what he believed. And so when an opportunity presents itself, all we can do is set things up to go right. When opportunity presents itself, we need to, and actually both he and his partner have been watching for the grandfather, so they could actually stop and get out and have a conversation with him. Maybe, will that change his paradigm? Will that change 30 years of a mindset and some probably very valid things that went on in his line? Maybe not, but our job is to set things up to go right. It is not to always guarantee outcomes. And that is why we need to do what we can to help with those youngsters who are hearing those kinds of things. Now, I know that's a bit of an extreme example, but that's a very real-world example, and what you say is true. And you make an interesting point about statistics, about the 75%. It's horrific. But the reality is sometimes we have a hard time. We have to understand what our responsibilities are, and we have to share what our responsibilities are. I think, and maybe the fact checker can do this, but I think Department of Justice statistics would say that 75 to upwards of 82% of the suspects identified in felonious crimes are black males between an age of this and this. Now, I may be wrong, but I may be overstating that, and that is horrifically painful. But it is nonetheless a statistic. Does that result in different treatment? Oh, absolutely, I'm sure it does, absolutely. But I don't know how far we can backwards engineer the fix to that, because we're in crisis mode most of the time. We run right at 1 million 911 calls a year, and we have a short time to do the best we can with a very broken situation. So we want to do sometimes a lot more than we can, but we need everyone's help. I think it's Sir Robert Peel that reminded us that we're all the community, we just are cops. We're all part of the same community. This is just a job we do. So it's not an us and them thing.
Well, I must respond to that. I would challenge that data simply because I just can't believe that when you compare what young people in this part of the city do compared to what young people do that are in the suburban areas, and I was told the same kinds of things, but the reaction of the police to the children that look like you is not to take them to jail or to the family court. Whereas in this community, the same action gets them actually charged with something. And I think it's our conditioning. It's how we look at who we are and how we look at other people and decisions that we make about them that may be legitimate or not. And I think that's some of the things that some of the statistics that you're talking about, that's the reason for it being out of balance. But to make a difference, in my opinion, I hope that I have lifted some things up that are of concern in the community and that need to be looked at. But I hope I've also impressed upon you the positives that are also happening and the relationship that we have that has produced some good outcomes in Ivanhoe. And I think that's at the heart of this. We've got to take the time to acknowledge that there are problems and that the solution to them is not the police solution, it's the community, all of us working together to solve these things. And then on the other hand, taking the time, each one of us, from whichever perspective, the community or the police, to lift up the things that are happening good. And I think when we can begin to do that, and I think you mentioned our listening to each other, that's just so essential. I wish Jim Thomas could be up here to tell you about that 10 hours we had together, because the strength of that was the listening. The community listening to what the officers were saying, and the officers listening to what the community. And initially, there were very divergent views. But as we talked and came together, we left there understanding each other better, and with the tools then to move forward, to have the relationship that we've been building over years. That's where it's got to start.
And that was exactly my point, was that sometimes that's what creates the biases that we have to fight so hard against. And our industry is no different. We have a lot of specialized training. We have a different level of accountability. But I think sometimes the world we live in, and the information we're assaulted with every day creates the biases. We don't want to be there, and we have to work against it.
We are running towards the end of our time, but I want to give as many questions as we can from the audience a chance to be heard.
Great. Let me first turn to former Councilman John Sharp with his question.
Well, thank you very much. This is going to be a little different aspect of police-community relations that we haven't really talked about yet tonight. But since law enforcement depends on community members to be their eyes and ears about possible criminal activity, will the threats of massive deportation of undocumented immigrants that we see in the news media practically every day, or maybe more than once a day, make it more difficult to obtain this vital information from segments of our community that might feel that if they report something, they could end up being detained themselves because they've seen television accounts of that happening to other immigrants in other cities? And what can we do to minimize this threat to effective law enforcement here in Kansas City?
Thank you, Councilman Sharp. Great question. Anyone? Wow. No answers, but a great question.
I don't mind, but I'm trying to, my family's in my background, in my head, so I'm going to let anybody else that wants to answer talk.
You know, the community organizer in me, once you're a community organizer, it's really difficult to sort of shake that social justice lens a bit. But, and I'm not a law enforcement officer, obviously, but, I would encourage our law enforcement agency not to participate in those sorts of practices that will further divide not only the relationship between the community and the criminal justice or law enforcement agencies, or police officers for that matter, but it's also going to contribute to more orphans and more children without parents in our community. And our community is not set up for that. Our system is not set up for that. And so I would encourage our law enforcement agency not to participate in those sorts of targeted activities.
I think Councilman Sharp, you're always going to be Councilman Sharp. I know you're retired, but you're always going to be Councilman Sharp to me. So, the funny thing is I think sometimes we do a palms up too when we hear that, because if we're not carrying that message, the message we know is coming from the national media, and, we try not to be, all of us obviously are political in one way or another, or somewhat less, or somewhere, but when we put the uniform and the badge on, we really try to be apolitical. And the interesting thing is, when you talk about immigration and enforcement, absolutely it's going to chase people further away and make us harder for us to get the information that we need to do our job locally. Why wouldn't it? I wouldn't answer the door. I'd be in the back closet and telling them, no, I'm not home. But the interesting thing is when you look at local law enforcement, and I don't mean to digress, but even if you look at the definition of what some people call sanctuary cities, it's sometimes simply defined as the level of engagement that the local law enforcement has. Well, here's the deal. I got to tell you, just from a money, manpower, and materials and staffing standpoint, we're just trying to get our basic job done. Now, if you're a really bad guy, a really bad gal, we want you whether you're here legally or not. But we have, in my 31 years, we have never actively participated with ICE or things like that. We may assist them in logistical issues and things like that, but we don't have the staffing to put forth to get our own work done. let alone everything else. So I think we're almost victimized too by the onslaught of media. And realistically, it goes back to the diligent intelligence or lazy intelligence. If you spend some time and look into it, it isn't going to be very easy to roll that out. It's not going to be very easy to hire and train 10,000. Is it 10,000 additional immigration folks? And the reality of it is, I think that it'll run into some logistical roadblocks. But most people just hear what they hear on the news. It scares them, and it makes it harder for us. So you're absolutely right.
Another question?
Sure. Kind of a two-part question here, different sides of a coin. This one from Laura in Kansas City. Recent reports show that in schools where on-site resource officers are present, more students are arrested, particularly black males. What do you think about officers in schools? How can it be addressed either way? And once you get past that answer, which I know will only take you about a minute, I'm sure, I want to talk a little bit about a pipeline of officers into the system. So I'll ask that question next. Why don't we hit that first one?
We are really short on time. So that first question about officers in schools, Margaret, you spoke in favor of more police in schools.
No. I'm not talking about being there to be the police.
You're
I'm
saying
talking
to
about
visit.
visiting
Okay.
the schools and interacting with the children, not to be the person there that's being the police in the school. I'm not for that at all.
Thank you. Others?
It's unfortunate that I was at a school earlier today doing a conflict mediation, and it's unfortunate that our educators are really put in a tough position. Not to divulge too much information, but even in the mediation I did today, 2 young men, these are 12-year-olds, both carried guns to school. One was selling weed, 12 years of age. I am not a supporter of having law enforcement officers in schools. However, when you have situations like that, I think there's the perspective from the administrative staff. When you have students coming into the school and you're faced with that, you're going to need to have law enforcement officers there. The problem, though, is there's space for them to be involved in those sorts of activities, but you shouldn't call a police officer to the classroom for disciplinary, right? That's where the line gets crossed. And that's where you see what you see on YouTube and on social media and whatnot when a law enforcement officer is called to remove a student. Well, they have specific training, and that if you don't comply, then But so I think there's a line to be drawn when it comes to that, and that's up to our administrative staff to really do their due diligence when it comes to those kinds of requests and those sorts of involvements all around to work those kinds of things out.
This is an issue all over the country, right, John?
Right, and I would say that you have to realize that school resource officer is a specialized position, and if you want to look up, there are organizations that deal with school resource officers. If you want to look at what they're kind of guided to do, it takes a special officer to do this, and they're really between a rock and a hard spot on many places. But I think what's important to understand is it is a specialized position that you just don't stick anybody into. So if you wanted to check out more, I just recommend that you can get online and see school resource officer organizations and some of the professionalism that they have, but also some of the awkward situations that they may be put in. So they're not a bad thing. It's just that you have to follow those guidelines tightly or it creates more problems.
Well, to answer that question specifically, I would need a lot more context and a lot more detail. But generally speaking, I can't agree with Dr. Hamilton more. But here's what happens. Here's the reality. I'm in class teaching my DARE students, my 3rd graders, and Miss Phelps, the teacher, comes and says, "Hey, Junior's waving a gun around in the hall, smoking a joint." Well, I'm teaching my DARE class, so I can't, you do the best you can, Miss Phelps. That doesn't happen. So sometimes you're right. We're forced into a role that takes advantage of our training, and and not that we want to be there. And so sometimes You know, I mean, it's horrific to hear stories like that, but I hear them all the time. So I need a lot more context on what they're referring to, but that's just a general answer, I think.
There is this one other question, and since you're over the police academy, this might make a lot of sense.
Certainly, you had mentioned a little bit earlier about your the swearing in officers ceremony recently. And this question comes from Sarah Starnes in Kansas City. Does Kansas City have a pipeline to recruit good candidates for police work here? In the D.C. area, Sarah mentions, there are high school police academies that recruit and train African American and other young people while they are still open to the possibilities of law enforcement careers.
Great question. I would say that we have fallen short on the pipeline, and that has happened for a number of reasons. One, we have rested on our status quo. Historically, we've had a fantastic pool of individuals to pull from, and I mean, you have to start with a good product to train them into being a great product. And in fact, I just had a long conversation the other day about establishing more pipelines, about formalizing things more. In fact, I asked the chief, and I'm on our May organizational development meeting, which is all the command staff, to talk to them about recruiting. Because really, technically, we have two recruiters who have to go everywhere and do everything. We need 1,300 plus recruiters. I had 3 people in the last academy class. One I got from a Sonic. One I found working at Sunfresh, and the other one was a college graduate he'd run away to Florida. He was a great basketball player where my daughters go to school. He had a criminal justice major. I heard he had a security job. We have fantastic workout facilities. They look like an NFL. So I sent him some pictures. I said, "Hey, what you doing?" He goes, "I'm in the gym." "Oh, me too. Here's my gym." He came up the following Tuesday to take the test. Urban core Chicago kid, 4-year degree, working as a security guard. He just graduated from the academy. So as far as pipelines go, I would love to see a formalized process, but we need to have eyes and ears on the streets every day, and we need your help, because I'll also throw it back on the community. What have you done to find good cops and send them our way? Because they're the ones that might come on your 911 call. So it's
real quickie, if I may. We will know we're really on the right road when we have children in elementary school saying, "I want to be a police officer when I grow up."
And on that note, I want to give us a chance to say thank you to all 4 of our panelists, John Hamilton, Damon Daniel, Bob Kuehl, and Margaret May. And before I turn it back over to Alan, I want to acknowledge my colleagues from KCUR who are here helping make this possible. But I also, at this last episode of American Public Square this year, want to acknowledge the staff of American Public Square, all of them, Alan Katz, and especially Jeff Fendorf, who has worked really hard on lining up this event throughout this year. So thanks to APS.
I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank all of the audience for being here. I want to thank our fact checker, and also look on the back of your program. If you see a star on the back of your program, we have a gift for you when you leave, so turn it in on the way out. I want to thank the volunteers who helped us tonight, in particular, and I'd like to present something to our panelists. We give each one of them an engraved civility bell. We hope they'll keep it in their office, and if things get a little too raucous, they'll hit the bell and everyone will calm down and continue to do that. We've also given them a year's membership in American Public Square, and we hope that they will come and attend some of our other events.
Thank you.
I think they gave us tonight, they gave new meaning to what was Lyndon Johnson's favorite saying, which was, "For every complicated problem, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong." and I think that I think our panel tonight did a wonderful job. Let me close with something that I'd like us all to think about on the way out, and it comes from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. It says, "We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may be strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Thank you all very much, and good night.